Hello, I'm going to walk you through the FusionAuth application today. There's going to be three parts to this demo. The first is a whirlwind tour of the backend administrative user interface. We will then log in as a user to an application. And finally, I'll show you how to make a couple of API calls against FusionAuth's API. To start off, I've logged into the backend admin UI and I have loaded up about 2,000 demo users. But other than that, this is a typical install. Now let's look at the tenant tab. Tenants are one of the core concepts of FusionAuth. They are the highest level logical grouping of users and applications. They are a separate user space, so you can have two different tenants and you have the same user with a different password. So the same identifier, dan@example.com, but a different password. You can have as many tenants as you want. You can see that two have been created for this demo. Let's look at the default tenant. So there are all kinds of settings at the tenant level. Some that you want to be aware of include the theme. So that is set at the tenant level. So that controls the look and feel of the hosted login pages that you can expose to your end users if you so desire. You also set up your email settings at the tenant level. So FusionAuth sends email if someone forgot their password or wants to change it, or you set up email verification. That all requires a valid SMTP server. You can set up various password settings. This includes password rules and breach password detection. And finally, you can customize FusionAuth in a lot of different ways, including how long various codes and emails are valid for, what codes look like, so whether they're bytes or digits, and that is a whirlwind tour of tenants. Now let's look at applications. Applications live within a tenant, and you can think of an application as something that a user would log into. So it could be a web application, it could be a third-party commercial off-the-shelf piece of software, it could be a single-page application, it could be an API. Doesn't really matter. If a user logs into it, you can represent it in FusionAuth as an application. You can have unlimited applications. Each application can have roles. Let's look at the roles of the demo application. So these are arbitrary strings. You can add as many as you want, and you should tune these to your business needs. Here we have administrative users, moderators, normal users. But if you were building an application for a real estate brokerage, you might have brokers, realtors, assistants. Let's take a look at the settings of the application. Let's go ahead and look at the demo application. So you can set this up in a variety of different ways. One common way to set up an application is to enable an OAuth grant. So let's go ahead and set that up for the demo application. We want to add a redirect URL. We want to make sure that the following grants are enabled: authorization code and refresh token. You can see that there are other grants that are supported. Other interesting aspects of the application include So if you have an application like Zendesk, which you want to authenticate against FusionAuth, so you store your user data in FusionAuth, you can do so. You can also enable self-service registration. And in this case, you can control which fields you want the user to enter when they are registering. And again, that page is themable. You also can create advanced registration forms that allow more customization, although we won't dig into that during this demo. Finally, you can log into FusionAuth without using OAuth. If you want to use our login API, we support passwordless login where you get a magic link as well. We are now on the Users tab. You can search your users and see just a subset of your users. You can sort, and then you can add or manage users. So when we're managing users, we can see to what application the user is registered. So that is the way that you can join between users and applications. So if a user is not registered to an application, they can authenticate against the tenant, but they won't be authorized to access the application. You can also assign users roles when they register. Users can be put into groups. This user is not a group. And users can have consents. And then something that's really great about FusionAuth is that users can have arbitrary key value data stored on the user and on the registration. So let's go ahead and add a user. You have to pick which tenant a user belongs to. You can either send them an email to set their password, or you can provide a default password. There's other information that you can store about a user. Including first name, last name. Let's go ahead and save this user off. Let's look at some of FusionAuth's configuration settings. So API keys are a way that you can interact with FusionAuth. FusionAuth is API first. Almost all functionality that is possible to do in this administrative backend system is possible via APIs. This UI itself uses the APIs. You can set up an API key. You can either use the generated random value, or if you have existing API keys that you want to not change, or values that you want to set in certain environments so that you have well-known values, you can set that as well. You can add a description. You may specify which tenant the API key is for, either all tenants or a specific one. And then you can limit API keys by endpoints. So each endpoint here corresponds to a piece of functionality. If I wanted to limit this API key to only being able to read applications or application data, I could do that. If you leave all of the endpoint permissions unchecked, if you don't limit the API key anyway, then it becomes a super user key which can be used for any API operation. Now let's look at identity providers. Identity providers are ways that FusionAuth can delegate authentication decisions to other providers. FusionAuth supports a number of social sign-on options, such as Google and Apple. It also supports identity providers that implement certain standards, such as OpenID Connect or SAML v2. If you have an identity provider who implements those, you can have a user log in to FusionAuth. FusionAuth will then delegate the authentication decision to an OpenID Connect provider, and then when someone successfully authenticates against that OpenID Connect provider, they will have a user account in FusionAuth. You may also authenticate against an external JWT provider, so any identity provider that can generate a JOT with the proper format can be used to create a FusionAuth user. And this, of course, is all under your control as the administrator. You need to configure each of these. That gives you the flexibility to have your users live in one place and authenticate against external providers if necessary. Now let's look at webhook. So we recognize that you need to integrate your identity provider into your other systems, and a webhook is a great way to do so. You can post a JSON payload to an arbitrary URL, as long as it's accessible to wherever FusionAuth is running, and you can do this for a variety of events. These can be events such as a user successfully logging in, a user failing to log in, a user being created. And so you can see that if you need to know when certain things happen in your authentication system, whether that's for security, compliance, analytics, whatever reason, it's very easy to create a webhook, have FusionAuth post that event when it happens, and then do whatever processing you need to do. Let's look at email templates. FusionAuth sends a lot of emails on your behalf. While defaults are provided, you are most likely going to want to customize the content of these emails. So here is the forgot password email. So whenever a user clicks on the forgot password link, they will be sent this email. You can see it says FusionAuth admin down there. You're probably going to want to change this to be more branded with your application, but FusionAuth provides HTML templates, text templates, and support for localization. So you can add a email template for any of hundreds of different locales. So that's email templates. Let's look at lambdas. So lambdas are an extension point. Similar to webhooks, you can create a lambda, and at certain points in a authentication lifecycle, that lambda will be called. So here we have a lambda that is called whenever a JOT is created. It is provided with the JOT object, the user object, and the registration object, and this is basically arbitrary JavaScript code. So you can pull items off the user object, you can pull items off the registration object, you can put in custom business logic, and all of that will be executed every time a JOT is created. You can add or remove things from the JOT. We have a number of different lambdas that are available. Oftentimes, when you have an identity provider and they give you back a user object, you want to do some customization or some tweaking of that user object before they are created in FusionAuth, and that's what those reconcile lambdas are all about. Let's look at themes. Themes are how the hosted login pages are customized, the look and feel of the hosted login pages. You have a default theme, which is unmodifiable. It's very easy to duplicate a theme, and once you've done so, you can change every aspect of this. Now you can use the UI, which is great for exploration. You can also drive all of this via the API, which is a good option if you are building out a number of themes or if you want to version control your themes. We are looking at the login page right now, and you can see that we've set a lot of free marker variables, but this is all customizable. You can also preview your theme, so as you make changes you can see how they look without having to go through the various flows. For instance, this is how the email verification screen will look if you set up email verification. So that concludes the whirlwind tour through the FusionAuth admin interface. So let's go ahead and log a user in. So I've set up a very simple application. This is an open source example application you can find on the FusionAuth GitHub. Obviously your application is going to be more complicated than this one because all this one does is let you log in and show the user's name. But this will show you what the process looks like. So we're presented with this login screen. And this is the user that I added. And there we are. Let's go ahead and take a quick look at the API. So I have written two scripts here. And the first will let you search for users, and the second will let you actually create users. These both use curl. However, you don't have to use curl. We have client libraries for most of the major languages: .NET, Java, Python, PHP, Ruby, JavaScript, and all of those client libraries give you a native language experience which ends up calling these API endpoints. So let's go ahead and run this user search. That looks a bit of a mess, so let's go ahead and pipe it through JQ. And you can see that we are given back user data as JSON by this search. Let's find the application for the demo app, and we will add a user to that application. So I'm going to run this registration. And I have now created this user. Let's search for them. Here they are. So this is a couple of very small examples of the FusionAuth API, but the documentation is extensive, and as I said, almost everything is accessible via the API. The only thing you can't do right now with APIs is generate new API keys, although there is an open GitHub issue about doing that, so we're considering that. It's on our roadmap. This concludes the demo for FusionAuth. Thank you for your time.